The Vanishing Pathway. On a crisp autumn morning in 2019, Lydia and her 9-year-old son, Tyler, set out for a hike in the Allegheny National Forest. The trail they chose was considered easy, weaving through a forest known for its ancient trees and serene atmosphere. Lydia, an experienced hiker, was vigilant about safety. Tyler was a quiet child who loved spotting wildlife and collecting unusual leaves. The first few hours passed peacefully. They even stopped for lunch near a gentle creek. Tyler wandered no more than 10 feet from her as he played with a stick in the water. Then, as she turned to pack up their things, she heard him say, "Mom, who's that over there?" Lydia looked up, but there was no one in sight. "Who are you talking about?" she asked, scanning the woods. Tyler pointed into the dense trees where shadows mingled with sunlight. "That lady. She's waving at me." There was no lady. Lydia's stomach tightened. She grabbed Tyler's hand, urging him to stay close as they continued back toward the trailhead. But the air felt wrong. The comforting rustle of leaves was replaced by an oppressive silence. A half-mile later, Lydia realized the path seemed unfamiliar. Panic set in as every direction looked the same. She pulled out her phone to check their GPS location, but the screen froze. When she looked down at Tyler, her heart froze, too. He was staring into the woods again, his expression vacant. "She wants me to come with her," he said softly. Lydia grabbed him and started running, her mind racing with fear. She didn't stop until she burst into a clearing where a small group of hikers stood, looking at her with alarm. Tyler was gone. Search teams combed the area for weeks, but no trace of Tyler was ever found. Disturbingly, one of the search dogs picked up his scent miles away, leading to a tree surrounded by hundreds of withered flowers. The searchers were baffled. It wasn't the right season for blooming. The Silent Camper. In 2006, 3 college friends decided to camp in Montana's Glacier National Park. Mark, Greg, and Allison had been inseparable since childhood and planned this trip as a way to bond before their lives diverged post-graduation. The first 2 nights were uneventful, filled with laughter and stargazing. On the third day, they ventured deeper into the wilderness, away from marked trails. They set up camp in a meadow surrounded by tall pines. Around midnight, Greg woke up needing to use the bathroom. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside the tent. Mark and Allison barely stirred. The next morning, Greg wasn't in his sleeping bag. His shoes and jacket were still in the tent, but there was no sign of him. At first, they thought he might have wandered to the creek nearby, but hours passed, and he didn't return. Mark and Allison reported him missing to park authorities, who launched a search. On the second day of the search, Allison noticed something strange while retracing their steps, a single bare footprint pressed deep into the dirt by their campsite. It was Greg's size but oddly elongated, as if his foot had been stretched. A week later, Greg's body was found sitting cross-legged miles from their campsite, in an area so dense with vegetation that searchers struggled to reach it. He was fully dressed, and his eyes were open, staring blankly into the canopy above. The coroner could find no cause of death. Stranger still, his feet were bare, but unscathed, despite the rugged terrain. His friends were left with an unsettling question: how did Greg end up so far away, with no signs of a struggle, and why did he appear to have just stopped? The Whispering Wind. In 2021, Emma Lurk, a solo hiker, set off on a backpacking trip in Oregon's Mount Hood National Forest. She was last seen by another hiker at the Ramona Falls trailhead, where she had chatted briefly about the unusually cold weather. When Emma didn't return home after 4 days, her family alerted authorities. A search team discovered her campsite a day later, untouched. Her pack and belongings were neatly arranged, but her boots were missing. A trail of faint footprints led into the woods before disappearing entirely in a patch of moss. A week after the search began, a local climber named Dave reported hearing strange noises while hiking the same trail. He described them as whispers carried by the wind, almost like a conversation just out of earshot. Thinking it might be searchers or hikers in trouble, he called out but got no response. Later that day, Dave stumbled upon a crude structure made of branches, almost like a shelter. Inside was Emma's jacket, draped carefully over a rock. Disturbingly, her boots were placed side by side at the entrance. No other signs of Emma were ever found. Whispers in the area have since become a common report among hikers, though no one has been able to identify their source. Locals now avoid the trail at dusk, calling it the Whispering Path. The Boy in the Clearing. In 2015, a young family from Idaho went on a camping trip in Yosemite National Park. Julia and Ryan Tanner brought along their 5-year-old son, Max, who was an adventurous, curious child. He loved exploring, but they made sure to keep a close eye on him. On the second day of their trip, they were hiking near a popular waterfall. Max was walking a few steps ahead when he called out, "Mommy, look! There's a playground." Julia, confused, quickened her pace to catch up. When she reached the spot where Max had been standing, he was gone. No playground. Just trees and a faint smell of damp earth. She screamed for Ryan, who rushed back to join her. They searched frantically, calling Max's name, but there was no response. Park rangers were alerted within hours, and a search operation was launched. On the third day, a searcher found Max sitting alone in a small clearing, 12 miles from where he'd disappeared. He was unharmed but eerily quiet, his clothes spotless despite the rough terrain. When questioned, Max only said, "I was playing with the other kids, but they told me I had to leave when the tall man came." When Julia asked what the tall man looked like, Max's face went pale. "He didn't have a face," he whispered. Max couldn't, or wouldn't, say anything else. To this day, he has no memory of what happened during those 3 days. The Echoes of Loon Lake. Loon Lake, deep in the wilderness of northern Minnesota, is known for its pristine beauty and haunting silence. In 2009, 2 seasoned hikers, Tom and Ellie, decided to camp near the lake's edge. They were used to remote locations and enjoyed the solitude. On their second night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, they heard what sounded like a baby crying. The sound carried over the water, faint but unmistakable. "Probably a bird," Tom suggested, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. But the cries persisted, growing louder, moving closer to their campsite. By midnight, the sound was right outside their tent. When Tom unzipped the flap to look, there was nothing there, just the moonlight reflecting off the still lake. The next morning, Ellie was gone. Tom panicked and searched the surrounding area, but there was no sign of her. The ground was undisturbed, her boots and jacket still in the tent. The park rangers launched a search, but they found no tracks, no clothing, nothing. A year later, a fisherman reported hearing a woman's voice near Loon Lake. "Help me," it said, faint and echoing. He searched the shoreline but found no one. Other hikers have since reported hearing the same voice, always near the water, always fading before they can locate the source. The Watcher in the Pines. In 1998, a group of high school friends took a weekend trip to the Great Smoky Mountains. Among them was Brian, an amateur photographer who brought along his prized camera. The group hiked deep into the woods and set up camp near a ridgeline. That night, Brian wandered off to take pictures of the stars. When he didn't return after an hour, his friends grew concerned and went looking for him. They found his camera sitting on a rock at the edge of a clearing, the lens cap off, but no Brian. The search for Brian lasted months. His body was never found, but his camera was sent to his family. Hoping for answers, they developed the film. Most of the photos were of the night sky, just as they'd expected. But the final 3 frames were different. The first showed Brian standing in the clearing, looking nervous. The second showed him facing the camera, eyes wide, as though startled by something behind the photographer. The third photo was completely black, except for 2 pinpoints of light, like eyes, staring directly into the lens. The hiker who came back. In 2017, Rachel, an avid solo hiker, disappeared in Colorado's San Juan National Forest. She had texted her family before setting out on a 5-day trek, promising to check in once she returned to civilization. When the week passed with no word, search teams were dispatched. They found her campsite abandoned, her tent zipped shut and her pack intact. Then, after 11 days, Rachel walked into a ranger station, barefoot and disoriented. Her clothes were torn, and her skin was covered in scratches. She claimed she couldn't remember where she had been nor how she'd survived. All she could recall was the man with the long arms who had been following her. When doctors examined her, they found something even stranger. Rachel's feet were pristine, with no cuts or bruises, despite having supposedly walked miles barefoot. She returned to her family but was never the same. She avoided the outdoors, and her once cheerful demeanor became withdrawn and anxious. Occasionally, she would wake in the middle of the night screaming about something tapping on the window. Her family lived in a third-story apartment. The Hunter's Cabin. In 1983, two hunters, Earl and Danny, ventured into the dense forests of northern Maine, far from any marked trails. They were experienced outdoorsmen and had a specific destination in mind, an old, abandoned cabin they had heard about from other hunters. When they reached the cabin, they were surprised to find it in excellent condition. It looked almost lived in, with fresh firewood stacked neatly outside and a faint smell of pine smoke in the air. The two decided to spend the night there. After a hearty meal, they fell asleep. Sometime around 2 a.m., Danny woke to a loud thud. He shook Earl awake, and they listened. The thud came again, followed by scratching on the wooden walls of the cabin. Thinking it might be a bear, they armed themselves and cautiously opened the door. The forest was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. When they went back inside, the cabin was different. The walls looked older, cracked and covered in moss. The fresh firewood was gone, replaced by rotten logs. They didn't stay to investigate further. Grabbing their gear, they ran into the forest, eventually finding their way back to their truck. Years later, Earl returned to the area out of curiosity. He found the cabin, but it was a crumbling ruin, clearly abandoned for decades. Inside, he found two sets of initials carved into the wall, EH and DB. They had never carved anything into the cabin during their visit. The lights on Timber Ridge. In 2002, a father and son, Jake and 12-year-old Ethan, went hunting in Colorado's White River National Forest. They set up camp near Timber Ridge, an area Jake had visited many times. On their second evening, as dusk settled, Ethan noticed strange lights flickering between the trees. They appeared to hover, shifting from white to green, and then fading. "It's probably other campers," Jake said, though his tone wasn't convincing. The lights seemed too high off the ground, moving too smoothly to be flashlights. Later that night, Jake woke up to the sound of rustling outside the tent. He unzipped the flap and found Ethan's sleeping bag empty. Panic surged as he grabbed his rifle and flashlight, calling his son's name. Jake followed Ethan's tracks for about half a mile before they abruptly stopped in the middle of a clearing. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where he could have gone. Search teams scoured the area, but Ethan was never found. However, multiple searchers reported seeing the same strange lights in the woods during the operation. Years later, a hunter discovered Ethan's hunting knife lodged in the trunk of a tree, 12 feet off the ground. The blade was pristine, showing no signs of rust, as though it had been placed there recently. The Disappearing Bridge. In 2018, two sisters, Mia and Lauren, were hiking in Washington's Olympic National Park. They planned a simple out-and-back route along a stream that was well marked on the map. Around midday, they crossed a small wooden footbridge over the stream. Mia took a picture of Lauren on the bridge, laughing as she splashed water on her boots. An hour later, they decided to turn back. But when they reached the spot where the bridge should have been, it was gone. The stream was still there, but no bridge crossed it. Confused, they walked upstream for nearly a mile, looking for any sign of the crossing. It was as if the bridge had never existed. Lauren checked her phone and found the photo she had taken earlier. There she was, standing on a bridge that no longer existed. Panicked, The sisters retraced their steps but quickly became disoriented. By nightfall, they stumbled upon a ranger station, exhausted and frantic. When they explained what had happened, the ranger frowned. "There hasn't been a bridge in that area for over 20 years, he said. The photo on Mia's phone mysteriously disappeared the following day. The silent snowstorm. In 1987, a family of 4 rented a cabin near the Green Mountains in Vermont for a Christmas getaway. The area was remote, accessible only by a narrow, winding road. One evening, as snow fell lightly outside, 8-year-old Sophie told her parents she wanted to play in the yard. They allowed her to go out but insisted she stay within sight of the cabin's window. Less than 5 minutes later, her father looked out to check on her. Sophie was gone. The snow-covered ground should have made tracking her easy, but there were no footprints leading away from the yard, just the one she'd made when she walked out. Panicking, her parents called the local authorities. A search party arrived quickly, combing the area despite worsening weather. Around midnight, the searchers heard faint giggling coming from the woods. They followed the sound for nearly a mile, only to find Sophie's scarf tied to a tree branch. The giggling stopped abruptly. Sophie's body was found months later, lying in a meadow miles from the cabin. She was barefoot, wearing her winter jacket, and her cause of death was hypothermia. Strangely, her feet showed no frostbite, as if she had never walked through the snow. The wrong voice. In 2013, 17-year-old Caleb went hiking with his dog, Scout, in Pennsylvania's Loyalsock State Forest. Caleb was familiar with the trails, and Scout never left his side. A few hours into the hike, Scout suddenly froze, growling at something in the woods. Caleb called his name, but the dog wouldn't budge. Moments later, Scout bolted into the trees. Panicking, Caleb ran after him, calling out. He heard a faint whistle up ahead, like someone calling for Scout. When he reached the clearing, Caleb found Scout sitting obediently, wagging his tail. But Caleb froze when he heard his own voice coming from the woods behind him. "Scout. Come here, boy." Terrified, Caleb grabbed Scout's collar and ran back toward the trailhead. He later told his parents and park rangers about the incident, but they dismissed it as an echo or an animal mimicking him. Caleb never went hiking alone again. The woman who didn't belong. In 1996, a group of campers in Michigan's Hiawatha National Forest reported a strange encounter during a weekend trip. Late one evening, they noticed a woman walking along the edge of their campsite. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress, and her skin was pale as the moonlight. One of the campers, Greg, called out to her, asking if she needed help. She turned to look at them, but her face was indistinct, as if blurred. Without a word, she disappeared into the trees. The group reported the encounter to a park ranger the next day. The ranger mentioned that several campers over the years had described seeing a similar woman. What disturbed the group most was what they found when they packed up to leave. The woman's footprints circled their tents in the dirt, several times. The Laughing Tree. In 2004, a botanist named Claire was conducting fieldwork in the Adirondack Mountains. She was alone, cataloging plants along an isolated trail. Around midday, she heard faint laughter coming from the forest. Thinking it was other hikers, she called out, but there was no response. The laughter grew louder, echoing strangely, as if coming from all directions. Claire turned around to head back to camp, but the trail seemed unfamiliar. She realized she was lost. Hours later, as the sun set, she stumbled upon a massive tree with thick, gnarled roots. The laughter was now coming from above her. She looked up but saw nothing. She stayed by the tree overnight, too frightened to wander further. When morning came, she found her way back to the trailhead. A week later, Claire developed an unexplainable fear of trees. She would break out in hives whenever she was near a forest and eventually abandoned her career. She never told anyone exactly what she had seen, or heard, near the tree. The Endless Echo. In 2010, A geologist named Dr. Daniel Weiss went missing in Utah's Zion National Park while conducting research on rock formations near the Kolob Canyons. Dr. Weiss was known for his meticulous habits and was in regular radio contact with his team. Around noon, he reported hearing strange echoes that didn't match the canyon's natural acoustics. "They're not right," he said over the radio, his voice uneasy. "It's like someone's mimicking me, but delayed." That was his last transmission. When his team reached his last known location, they found his backpack neatly placed beside a large boulder, as though he'd set it down and walked away. Tracks led a short distance toward the edge of the canyon, but abruptly stopped. Searchers used drones to scan the area but found no trace of him. Months later, hikers reported hearing a man's voice faintly echoing through the canyon walls, calling for help. One hiker even claimed to hear the voice repeat their own words back to them, but with a strange, metallic tone. No remains or further clues have ever been found. The Silent Field. In 1974, a small group of Boy Scouts went camping near the Ozark National Forest. On the second day of the trip, 13-year-old Michael wandered away from the group to retrieve firewood. He never returned. The scout leader, Mr. Daniels, organized a search party, but Michael had vanished without a trace. Hours later, they stumbled upon a large field they hadn't seen on their way in. It was unnervingly quiet, no birds, no insects, just complete stillness. At the center of the field was Michael's jacket, neatly folded and placed on the ground. Mr. Daniels approached the jacket, calling Michael's name. As he bent down to pick it up, the entire group heard a deafening hum, like an engine revving in the distance. Then it stopped, and the field seemed to darken slightly, as though a cloud had passed overhead. They left the area immediately, and despite extensive searches, Michael was never found. Decades later, locals claim the field is cursed, animals avoid it, and electronics often malfunction when near it. The Cabin in the Ravine. In 1999, a pair of friends, Mark and Jonah, were hiking in the dense forests of Montana when they got caught in an unexpected storm. As the rain poured, they searched for shelter and stumbled upon an old cabin in a ravine. The cabin appeared abandoned, with broken shutters and ivy creeping up its walls. Desperate to escape the rain, they went inside. The interior was sparse, just a table, 2 chairs, and an old wood stove. But what struck them was the smell, a faint, metallic odor, like blood. That night, Jonah woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Peeking through the broken window, he saw a man standing motionless in the rain, his face obscured by shadows. Jonah woke Mark, but when they looked again, the man was gone. The next morning, they left the cabin and climbed out of the ravine, eager to return to their car. But no matter how far they walked, the trail didn't match their map. It was as though the forest had shifted. Hours later, they stumbled back into the ravine, right in front of the same cabin. They never spoke about what happened next, only that they were found by a search party 3 days later, miles from the cabin's location. Jonah refused to hike again and developed a fear of storms. The Vanishing Stream. In 2016, a couple, Jamie and Lisa, were hiking in Oregon's Crater Lake National Park when they noticed a beautiful, crystal-clear stream off the trail. They decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a picturesque spot for photos. The stream wound deeper into the forest, and the couple lost track of time. When they decided to turn back, the stream was gone. They were sure they'd been following it directly, yet there was no sign of water anywhere, only dry, cracked earth where the stream should have been. As they searched for the trail, Lisa began to feel dizzy, claiming she could hear faint voices calling her name. Jamie heard nothing and tried to reassure her, but the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Hours later, they stumbled upon a ranger station and reported their experience. The ranger frowned and explained that there had been no streams in that area for decades, it had dried up in the 1980s. The Shadow on the Mountain. In 1985, climber Eric Patterson disappeared while attempting to summit Long's Peak in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. Eric was an experienced mountaineer and had been climbing solo. Other hikers reported seeing him on the trail early that morning, in good spirits. By nightfall, Eric hadn't returned to the trailhead. Search teams found his gear stashed near a ledge, as though he'd set it down to rest. His tracks led a short distance beyond the ledge but then vanished. A week later, another climber, Alex, reported a strange encounter near the same spot. He claimed to see a shadowy figure standing on the ledge at sunrise, unmoving. When Alex called out, the figure turned and seemed to dissolve into the rock face. To this day, climbers speak of seeing Eric's shadow on the mountain, always at dawn, always in the same spot.